Welcome to Hallway Conversations with Matt and Dave. We've both been teaching for quite a while now, but we still have plenty of questions about education. And this podcast is our place for thinking out loud together about topics that we think are important for Christian educators to consider. Welcome to the conversation.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Hallway Conversations. I'm Matt Beamers.
And I'm Dave Mulder.
And we are just two good friends who love talking about education in the hallway, and we just want to share some of those ideas with you. We come with a question, and we see where it goes, and it's pretty unscripted. But to say we are prepared would be a gross overstatement at this point, beyond having the question. So we're just going to have some fun and see where it goes. So Dave, I'm coming with the question today, and my question for you is, what's up with the management word when we talk about classroom management? And is that even the right word?
I've wondered that before, right? Like, who or what am I managing when we talk about classroom management, right? Like, am I managing materials in the room? Am I managing, the flow of information? Am I managing the workspace? Or am I managing people, right? And the way that you answer that question, I think, changes the dynamic for what you're actually going to do in the classroom. And thinking about, like, is management the right word? I don't know what word I would substitute for that off the top of my head.
Well, if you think about that, if you think about your illustrious career, we're just going to use the word illustriously quite loosely.
Thank you. Yeah.
But if we think about that and your understanding, maybe if you can just sort of think back to your understanding of what you believed classroom management to be when you started teaching.
Sure.
And what you understand it to be now.
Thank you.
How has that changed, maybe?
So, I think most beginning teachers, we don't know our head from our elbow half the time when it comes to actually managing a classroom, right? And it's so hard because how do you become a 10-year veteran? You got to go out and teach for 10 years, right? That's the only way to do it. And so early in my teaching career, I think I was looking for the quick fix, some kind of bag of tricks that I could, and I'm going to magically wave my magic wand and everyone's just going to jump through the hoops and do exactly as they're told. And I guess the longer that I've taught, the more I've realized that control in the classroom is kind of an illusion, right? How much of this social contract is just, because I'm the one up in front, the students listen to me. If they all decided to get up and walk out the door, what power do I actually have to keep them in the room, right? That's kind of a weird way of thinking about it.
No, but it is like this idea of a social contract. Like, there's some days where you're like, I'm just glad they stayed.
Right.
Thank you for staying.
Yeah.
There's no quick fix, and we, even as we're talking about this and as you're talking about it, I almost worry that somehow in having this conversation, we're going to somehow come off as the experts on this.
Man.
Like, here.
Yeah.
So if any of you, as you're listening to this, that this comes off as like, do as we say, or like we have got the corner on the truth in classroom management, that's not our intent, and we mean that. Like, we're talking about it, we're discussing it, but we could easily spend the next 15 minutes talking about horror stories in our own classroom management.
Man.
And I think we've both grown in it, but maybe for you, Dave, for who you are, and this idea of teaching who you are, what has been the key for you in successful classroom management when it does go well?
Yeah. No, and I'm so glad you said that too, Matt, because it's not like I have this all figured out, right? Like, each of us is a work in progress. Yeah. And that goes for all of us as teachers, right?
Absolutely.
We never arrive. We just keep getting closer. So I guess I would start to answer that question by thinking about what do I want to have happen in my classroom? Mm-hmm. What do I really want? Well, I want students to learn, right? And I think that fundamentally, that has to be the driving principle. And if I want students to learn in my classroom, I have to try to create an atmosphere and a climate where learning is likely to flourish. And so how do I do that? Well, when I was a middle school teacher, early on, I guess I thought a lot about, I'm going to punish their misbehavior. And that that kind of an idea, right? Like, thinking about it in terms of discipline. And my management plan was probably really structured around, disciplining students if they stepped out of line, right? And I became aware of the limitations of that because there are some kids who you can't make them, right? Like, and I've had several of those students in my teaching career. I suspect you probably have too. And,
Absolutely.
And so I guess getting past that sense of just punishing misbehavior, well, something that we talk about around here, and maybe this doesn't work for your institution, dear listener, but I mean, around here we talk about like office consciousness sometimes, right? Like now I got to explain what I mean by that.
Yeah, and just as before you do that, Dave, that's funny because I was actually thinking about that word. That's a new word for me as someone who's new around here, and I was thinking about that word when you talked about if this is what I want to happen, then this is what I need to do, and I actually thought about that in terms of, if I want this to happen, then this is sort of the responsibility that comes with my office. Right. So I'm glad you mentioned office because I was sort of going there too. So
okay.
Can you just
we're on the same page.
Can you just riff on that for all? I'm trying to use a cool word there, but you can riff on that for a minute. Office.
So if you think about like a politician who is in office, maybe that's the best way of thinking about it, right? Because of this position that you're in, you have certain rights and responsibilities. And I think that extends to a lot of different things, right? So as a teacher, I mean, like we're recording this in my office. That's not the sense that we're talking about, right? But my office as the teacher means I have a certain authority about me. I have certain rights, but I also have certain responsibilities. And administrators have an office, not like the principal's office, but I mean, they have rights and responsibilities and certain authority because of their position. But so do students. We can also think about students having an office. They have certain rights and certain responsibilities because of the office that they hold. And I don't know if that resonates for our listeners, if they see that in their own school setting, right? Whatever their institution looks like. But that's something that we've talked a fair bit about. And so the connection, I guess, for management is when I'm thinking about myself in this office of the teacher, okay, so I have a responsibility then for trying to set this environment where learning can take place. And that means there is some sense of management that I have to do to ensure that that will happen.
So just to follow up on that, though, because I also noticed that you use like students also have an office.
Yeah.
And then that comes with rights and responsibilities that are obviously going to be different than the teacher. But it makes me wonder, Dave, like in holding that office of teacher and being responsible for, the things that are the learning, the culture, the climate. But because students have an office as well, do they sort of get a voice like is part of our responsibility giving them a voice into sort of, hey, what do we want this class to look like in terms of culture and safety and management and I don't know, like did you give students a voice in that?
Yeah, so, that's an interesting question because I struggle with that a little bit, right? And I'll point that out for myself that I do see myself like I'm the leader in this classroom, right? Because of my office, but that shouldn't be me somehow lording it over my students then, because they also have some rights and responsibilities in their office. So I guess that would be the ideal, that I can give up some of my power to empower students, right? That we're in this together. And it's not my classroom, it's our classroom. And I've got a particular role to play in that because of my office, but students too have a role to play. I don't know, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, no, that does resonate. I guess I'm thinking about my own understanding of classroom management when I started was, well, it wasn't great to begin with, but I think I saw it as sort of like, hey, here's the rules that we need, and this idea of like, these rules are sort of happening to you, like I am putting them on you, and there might be a time and a place for that, but I guess I'm thinking like in some of the work at my previous school, around restorative practices, I'm thinking more about how do you shift the mindset of like from this is happening to you to happening with you. So that in a sense, I'm wondering about like, again, if I think about to back when I started, like I had a really, if I'm honest, a real punitive approach to classroom management. And it was actually really simple in a sense because it was like, oh, like you don't do this, here's sort of the consequence, and or if you do this, here's the consequence, and it could be a name on the board, and if you get a check mark, I mean, it was not great, to be honest with you. But I'm also now thinking about this idea of with, and not not rules, but I guess I've seen a number of educators, and I really like the language here. So it's not my language, but using this idea of norms, like what do we want to be normative in this classroom? What do we want when we walk through the front door of the school, or even of this class? What can what can each student and teacher expect? Like, no, like this is what is normal. This is what this is normal. And the idea of like, who sets that? Right. Like, do I set that, or do we set that together? I walked into, there was a grade 5 teacher I worked with, Amanda, and she's the kind of teacher, you want your kids in that class.
Yeah.
But she had a way of being in her class where she never raised her voice. She never, like, there was just this calmness, and yet the learning was crazy, but the management was like, it just worked. And I noticed in her class, like this idea of like these agreed upon norms. And I think if I remember right, in student handwriting, like, it's like, no, like this is what we're saying as students. We want this learning space to be like, and there's no doubt that she gave some guidance to that, but they really had a voice. So I'm just wondering about that idea of like, hey, how do we maybe even shift from management to sort of norms, and thinking about that, and just as you're talking, Dave, I'm thinking about, okay, so the hardest class I ever taught was kindergarten PE.
Oh yeah.
What? All you students who will never listen to this, but in Montana, in my kindergarten PE class, I want to publicly apologize for what a disaster that was. But part of and I loved it. Like, these kids were amazing. Like, I'm smiling as I'm even just thinking about them. But I can remember, literally, I think in my first kindergarten PE class, I was sort of like, we're all going to run a lap. And I didn't even think anything of it. It's like, we're just all going to run a lap. And I blow the whistle, and it's bedlam in there. And I remember I end up literally, again, in my first class, walking to the principal's office with a student who has a bloody nose because they were just running everywhere. Wow. And it's because I made an assumption that they all know how to do this. They all know the expected. I thought this is what running a lap means. And it makes me wonder, even in terms of if these are the norms, do we give students actually time to practice that in order to succeed? If I think about think about what if I would have actually said to the students, we're going to practice running a lap, because I'm not going to assume you know how to do this. Mm-hmm. Just like we do on a sports team, we're going to practice our free throws. And it makes me think, do we need to spend more time helping kids succeed with norms by helping them practice? So that I'm a little off track, but that's just what I'm thinking right now.
That's such a helpful way of framing this. And immediately, as you said, practice, I'm thinking back to Harry Wong, for teachers of a certain age, The First Days of School is the name of his book, right? And it's all about this idea of, if you want students to behave in certain ways, you need to teach them the procedures and give them opportunities to practice. Yeah. Right? And that, I think, dovetails with what you're talking about here for norms, right? You need to, let's clearly say this is what we expect, and then let's make sure that we practice it so that we know that we do that for so many other things, right? You have students practice their math problems, they practice their music for their playing their instrument, they practice their free throws and stuff, right? Shouldn't we?
And it makes, and I'm suddenly making a connection to a phrase you used in our first or second podcast, this idea of clear is kind.
Yeah.
Right? And that's true with norms and protocols and practicing to see expected behavior, but also, to be honest, to say, like, not every student comes into our classroom actually knowing what the expected behavior is.
That's right.
And if that's the goal, I guess my encouragement would be, then practice, model it, give students a chance to succeed. I'm making a really big leap here to Nicholas Woltersdorf quote. He says, like, it's nothing but, I think he uses like a naive wish or an unwarranted hope that students, like, upon graduation, when they go out into the world, are gonna change and shape culture if we haven't given them time to practice it in school. Like, if that's what our deep hope for is when they leave, then let's spend time practicing it. And if we have deep hopes around student behavior, then I think we also, it's nothing but it's an unwarranted hope to say, like, how can you, this is what we agreed upon,
Right.
but you're not doing it. It's like, well, maybe we just need to actually say, let's practice what this looks like.
So it's not just going to be about discipline. The root of discipline and discipleship is really the same word, right? The discipline, discipleship. And so what if we would shift our mindset when we're talking about classroom management? I mean, this is an opportunity for forming disciples, right?
Yeah.
This is really about formation, that we're trying to help our students live into a better story, right? Whatever story they might be telling themselves or has been told to them, that they can have a little bit bigger vision for what their life might look like. Maybe that sounds a little too philosophical and pie in the sky.
No, I don't think so. Like, well, maybe it is, maybe it does. But I like this. But I like this idea of, like this idea of of what are the formative practices even around behavior, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because those practices are not only going to manifest themselves inwardly, they're going to do something to us, and it's going to impact our behavior in a classroom. Like even again, I'm just thinking about how formative something like a check-in question can be at the beginning of a day. Like, in my mind, that's a formative practice. Someone I taught with, Ashley, she called it campfire, and she had this cool looking crafty campfire in the middle of the room that I couldn't make if my life depended on it. And these students would sit around the campfire, but she would start with around the campfire, like at the beginning with a check-in question, or at the end of the day, hey, before you leave here, I want to know how you're doing.
Yeah.
And then and instead of just kind of the casual, which I do all the time, hey, how you doing, in a quick response, we're going to sit in a circle. We're going to face each other, and you can pass if you want. You can, but how are you doing? And she'd always have kind of these cool check-in questions. And I often wonder, for students in Ashley's class, sort of what was that doing to them, in terms of their own human flourishing, right? That hey, you've got 21 other students listening to you right now that care about you. So I'm making I guess I'm thinking about something like, hey, there's no quick fix, and something like a check-in question she did every day. So you're talking about 180 check-in, check-out questions.
Hey, but that comes to this idea though of practice, right?
Totally.
That if we set this as this is how we do things, this is the norm for us, and does that start to head off some of these other behavior problems that we would then have to manage, right? We've got to get to their hearts. That's what we're aiming toward.
And it just makes me think, even in thinking about discipleship, what's the discipleship that's happening in that circle? Yeah. And it makes me also wonder, it makes me wonder how often, the starting point for classroom management is, around relationship. So not only is Ashley getting to know those students better, but those students are actually getting to know each other better, right? Whether they think about it or not, they're building relationship. This is how I'm doing. And as you build relationship, you build trust. And as you build trust, what might that do to those students who forming them, and then what might it do to the classroom culture? And so it just makes me come back to this idea of hey, relationship. But the second part, Dave, and I know we're getting a bit long here, but I also, and I don't want to sound grumpy about this, so I'll say this looking in the mirror as someone who's learned this the hard way, that a big part of classroom management is simply being ready as a teacher, good pedagogy, good learning plans. I know times in my career, and not just when I was younger, when sort of the class, you just lose the class. It's just, they're not tracking it. There's an unsettledness, there's more background noise than what for you that you're comfortable with. And so often in those moments, I'd want to get grumpy at the students,
right?
when in fact it started with just really bad teaching, right? Like, so like,
Oh, man.
I'll say it for Matt Beamers. One of the things I had to learn was don't blame your students for getting off track when you are more off track than they ever were, when you were not ready to go. And so yeah, for sure it's about relationships, but it's also just about actually like that office of teaching.
Right.
Like one way you lead as a teacher is by being ready to go every day, by like, what's the pedagogy, what's the learning plan, what's the learning targets. And then when it doesn't go well at times, and I'm not saying it's always on us, but to also be able to once in a while say, yeah, I can't really blame them because like I was not in the right
It was
place.
me.
It was me, right? And sometimes it's not, and a lot of times it's not.
Right.
You know what? Like, we need to give ourselves grace. We need to give them grace. Yeah,
We're all in this together.
we're all
Right.
in this together. We are all in this together. And my last thought, and going a bit maybe off the beaten path here, is one of the reasons I'm thinking about some of those students who come into our class that behavior is hard, is like it's hard for them to demonstrate the expected behavior. Is also in thinking about them is that one of the reasons they need accountability is because the classroom might be the only place where they're held accountable and encouraged. And so they may push back against that. But that doesn't mean they don't need it, and it actually doesn't mean they don't appreciate it or don't even want it. And in setting, this idea of clear as kind around what are our classroom norms, when you do that, some students may articulate that they have less freedom, and students are going to articulate, that's going to look different. But in the end, you're actually in my mind, you're actually giving them the gift of freedom, because you're sort of saying like, these are the boundaries around what's normative and what's not. And there's actually tons of freedom in there. And when a student can walk into your class knowing, hey, like, there's clear boundaries and there's follow through and there's consistency in those things, actually students actually are gonna be way more relaxed than in the classroom where those boundaries aren't clear. Even though they may say, hey, we can do what we want. Actually, you know what? I'm convinced students actually don't want to do what they want. Like,
Right.
they actually want those boundaries for the most part. And so I just offer that as an encouragement is to say, like, there's tons of freedom within the law. We know this as people as Jesus followers, and we know that to be true in our classroom.
Matt, I love thinking out loud with you around challenging topics like these. And so thanks to all of you for listening in today, too. We know your time is precious. We hope this is opportunities to foster more hallway conversations in your institutions as well. You can always reach out to us via email at hallwayconvospod@gmail.com. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for joining us in the hallway, everybody.
This podcast was quite literally dreamed up by Matt and Dave during one of their hallway conversations. Our music was created by Ethan Mulder. Hallway Conversations is an independent podcast created and produced by Dave Mulder and Matt Beamers. Thanks for listening.